Yoel, super excited to be emailing you. I hope this gets through to you and you can discuss on one of your upcoming videos. I recently began private pilot training and have been hearing from many that the way to go about things is to knock out the written test first and then devote all my energy to flight training. As a longtime viewer of the channel, I highly respect your opinion and wanted your take on this matter. Thanks again for all you do, James. James, my man. All right. This is, again, for those of you who have watched the last few questions that I answered on the channel, as I always do say, through all the email questions that I receive, I typically like to answer those that I feel could add value to the most amount of people. It doesn't mean I don't want to get and won't try to get through all of them, but specifically on the topic of knocking your written test out and when exactly to do it, I know firsthand that is a big topic on many student pilots' minds, and many people are not sure how to go about it. So James wants my opinion. I'm sure many others out there are curious what my thoughts are about this. So here's what I'll do, James. And you know who you are. I'm leaving your last name out of it, like I always do, just for privacy purposes. But here we go. I will answer your question about specifically when I think someone should take their written test within the flight training process. I promise I'll answer your question. But I don't want to say issue, but what I want to discuss on this video here while answering James' question is something that goes a little deeper and beyond written tests. And it's something I talk a lot with people about, specifically when they ask me, hey, I want to take my written test first. What do you think? Or I want to take it later or now, whatever, the whole thing. So here we go. And it's something I call personal minimums versus personal standards, or personal standards versus personal minimums. And here's what I mean by that. If you've been in the flight training world for even a week, you've probably heard the term from your instructor or from friends of yours, you've probably heard the term personal minimums. Personal minimums is all over flight training. It's during the instrument training phase. There's a lot of discussion about, hey, I know the approach says, the minimums on the approach are 200 feet. What's your personal minimums? It's all over the private pilot phase. Heck, your solo begins with personal minimums written out by your instructor on your endorsement, as far as the winds and the ceilings and all the good stuff, right? So personal minimums are embedded deeply into the flight training process, and they have been for as long as airplanes existed, I'm sure. So personal minimums is something we're all familiar with. It's hammered into our heads. We all think about blah, 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 blah. Here's something I thought about over the years of flight training and coming across a bunch of people who specifically, as it relates to James' question, talk about the written test, but it goes beyond that. And that is personal standards. Personal minimums, we're familiar with them. They're popular. We all know what they are. We love our personal minimums. But what about coming up with personal standards in the sense of, sure, I have a personal minimum. I have a bare minimum. I have a lowest something I'm willing to deal with. But why not also go about flight training with what I call personal standards? And I'll give you an example of personal standards specifically as it relates to James' question. If you're preparing for a written test, and this is where I'm answering your question, James. If you're preparing for a written test, doesn't matter which one it is, instead of showing up and going, well, I want to knock the written test out first so I could devote my energy to flying later. Or what's the bare minimum score that I need? Oh, it's 70. Let me make sure I get 70 and I'll take the test. Instead of approaching it that way, what I tell my students and all students is approach it from a personal standard standpoint. Increase your personal standards. And even though the minimum score is 70, even though your instructor may endorse you by showing them a practice test result of 70 or 80 or whatever it might be, I want you to come up with your own personal standard, meaning a score or a number of tests in a row that you scored over a certain score, that only then will you think about going and taking the written test. It's a whole shift in thinking. Instead of approaching this from a standpoint of minimums, right? What's the least I could do and knock that test out so I could move on? Instead, I want you to show up and think of it from a personal standard standpoint. And even though if your instructor says, hey, show me 3 tests above 80 and I'll endorse you, I challenge you to come up with your own personal standards, your own personal minimums here, and say, even though my instructor will give me the endorsement with those 3 over 80, I am only taking the written test once I've produced at least an X amount of tests above this minimum score. And that's your personal minimums. No one else is imposing that on you. It's your own personal minimums. So with that, here's how I'll answer this question as far as when to take the written test. It's not a matter of sooner versus later. If there's any energy associated with you wanting to take the written test that has that energy of, I just want to get this over with, I just want to be done with thinking about it, I just want to move on with my training, don't take the written test. It won't do you good. It won't do you good because now you're looking for shortcuts. Don't do that. Instead, I urge you to think about this from a standpoint of, what are my high personal minimums, and hold yourself to high standards. Not personal minimums, I mean high standards. Hold yourself to high standards. Figure out that number for yourself. Most students, if not hearing this, most likely only look to produce the minimum amount that their instructor asks of them, unless they have an instructor who understands this concept and actually asks of their students more of the bare minimum, which I think is phenomenal. I think it should be normal. I think that's the way it should work. But unless you have that kind of an instructor who doesn't hold you to high standards, you have to hold yourself to high standards. So I'll give you an example, real example. What I require of my students to produce and show me before I have them go and take the written test are 5 consecutive. So if you did 4 and then you had 1 which was under and then another one, that's not consecutive. 5 consecutive written practice tests of over 90%. That's what I personally require of my student. And if I had a student who showed up and said, Yoel, I like your standards here, but I want to hold myself to 5 above 95. Amazing. It would make my day. It would make my day that their own standard for themselves is higher than the one I imposed for them. Okay? But I'm just sharing my personal standard to which I hold my students when it comes to taking written tests. Now, I'm assuming many instructors out there don't require this, and that's fine. But what I'm asking you to do is require this of yourself. Nowhere in flight training, there's no FAR or any place on the FAA's website that says that you as a student pilot are not allowed to hold yourself to any standard that you wish to hold yourself to. There's not one place I've ever come. There's no advisory circular. There's no ADs. There's no nothing. There's no place I've ever found that prohibits student pilots from holding themselves to whichever standard they wish to hold themselves to. Now, sometimes a student pilot's standard for themselves could be so great that it actually ends up hurting them. I've seen it I see it all the time. Right? And you have to kind of help your student find that balance. And if you're one of those, I talk a lot about a lot in my videos. People who are way too hard on themselves. I talk a lot about giving yourself a break in flight training. That could partially come from a place of holding yourself to standards you're not quite ready for. Maybe in a month you could hold yourself to that standard. But right now you're not there. So even though too high of a standard, too soon in the process could hurt you, nonetheless, I'm asking you, I challenge you, hold yourself to a higher standard than the bare minimum when it comes specifically, as far as the question is concerned, to written tests. So I want you to stop thinking about, am I taking it now? Am I taking it later? I want to get it out of the way. No. Instead, what I want you to do is hold yourself to a higher standard. And by that, I mean challenge yourself hold yourself accountable and tell yourself and stick to it and say, I'm not taking my written test until I produce an X amount of consecutive tests. Now, the power with consecutive is it shows you that it's not a fluke. Because if you say, I just need 3, well, in what time frame, right? You could produce 3 tests of over 90 in the period of a month. But if you produce 5 consecutive tests over 90, that's pretty good proof that you have a good hang of the topics, of the material, of the knowledge. And so if you go into the actual test, and now you take into account test anxiety and you're flipping out and you forgot something, okay, then you drop into maybe the mid 80s. Or maybe you're one of those who test anxiety increases your performance and you fall into the low 90s or maybe mid 90s or heck, even 100, hopefully. But you get the idea. So 5 consecutive tests over 90 in a row. That's when I urge people only then to go and take the test. Now, I personally know people who their standards for themselves when it came to this was higher. They held themselves to 5 consecutives over 100, or not over 100, at 100%. Other people, it doesn't matter. The idea here is don't go for bare minimums. So challenge yourself to a certain standard, and once you meet that standard, go take the test. Now, throughout training, what period do I recommend taking the test? This is something that I struggle in answering for people. It really has to do with each individual on an individual basis. Some people, I've had students before who just the idea of the test hanging over their shoulder literally got in their way of training. And so you figure, okay, let's focus on the test, take the test, and we'll finish with it. Other people, it's much better for them if they went and took the test later on in training because now they had time to live the material and the topics that the written test covers. They actually flew traffic patterns. They actually did stuff. So generally, I'm not a fan of knocking it out soon just to get it out of the way because, again, there's an energy there of I just want to shove it under the rug and move on with it. And that's an energy I don't endorse when it comes to flight training in general. Okay? But I just want to make sure I got your name right. I'm not forgetting it. James. James, might be one of those who just the idea of a written test hanging over your head might just cause you to not be able to sleep at night. In which case, sure, focus on the test and knock it out. But still, hold yourself to that higher standard and don't go for minimums. And I could tell you firsthand, I know this for a fact, the vast majorities of CFIs will not ask 5 consecutive over 90s. Okay? I could tell you this right now. And so what that means is that your instructor is probably one of them who won't ask for 5 consecutives over 90. For whatever reason, maybe they don't think you could do it, maybe they think it's too much, whatever it might be. But here I am asking you to hold yourself to that standard. And like I said before, you as a student pilot have all the power to hold yourself to that standard and to not take the test until you produce those results. So here's the flip side, the backside of everything I'm talking about. What holding yourself to this standard will do is it will make you spend whatever amount of time studying that you need to put in order to produce those results. You see, it's not like I'm sitting here and saying, get 5 over 90s consecutively and then take the test as if there's nothing to it. Obviously, for you to produce the 5 over 90s, you will have to put in a tremendous amount of work and time. Okay? And you understand that. You know that it doesn't just come to you. But that's the whole idea. By me holding my student to that standard, it's me, in other words, telling my student, I know you could put in whatever amount of time is needed to get yourself to a place where you could produce 5 consecutive tests over 90. That's the unspoken words that I'm communicating to my student when I hold them to that standard. Now, mind you, I didn't tell my student 10 consecutive tests at 100 because that would be a little crazy. Even though completely possible, you could put in more time and study the material through whatever methods you study best, and you could produce 10 consecutive written tests, practice tests, over 100. Totally possible. Might take you a little longer, but you could do it. I also think that it's unnecessary. It's a little too much. But the 5 consecutive over 90s, that's what I hold my students to. You might hold yourself to 3 consecutives over 90s. You might hold yourself to 5 consecutive over 80s, whatever it might be. I'm just telling you to try and raise your standards as much as you can. Because one thing I've found, and I know true for a fact, is that if you think you could do better, you will do better. And if you think you can't do better, you won't do better. That's just how we operate and work as humans. So James, to answer your question, when should you take the written test? I can't specifically answer for you specifically because I don't really know you beyond reading your question. So I don't want to tell you what or when to do it. Obviously, there's pros and cons to both. But generally speaking, I'm not a fan of just rushing through things and knocking them out for the sake of knocking them out. That said, whenever it is you do take your test, okay, just like we all talk about personal minimums and we all have personal minimums, I hope I'm able to convey how important personal standards are when it comes to flight training. And you should have a list of personal standards, just as long of a list, just as big of a list as your personal minimums list is. We all should, okay? The standards we should hold ourselves to should be just as tight and clear and concise as the minimums that we supposedly don't go under with our personal minimums list. So I hope what you get out of this video is this. We all have personal minimums. Start thinking personal standards and ask yourself, is my CFI holding me to high enough standards? And if they are, phenomenal. Stick with them. Excellent. I'm all about it. You should be happy and you should feel lucky because many CFIs don't. And if your CFI is not holding you to high standards, hold yourself to those standards. Hold yourself to those standards. You could do it as a student pilot. You could do it as an instrument-rated pilot. You could do it as a commercial pilot. You could hold yourself to any standard you wish to hold yourself to. I'll give you another stupid example, then we'll wrap this video up because I don't want to take too much time. Let's say you do a steep turn and your CFI says, okay, it's fine. Let's move on. It's within standards, right? If you ever hear CFI say that, never sits well with me. Never sits well with me when I hear people say it's within standards because that's not what we're shooting for. We're shooting for perfection. We'll never be perfect, but that's what we're always shooting for, okay? So saying it's within standards is always made me cringe. It always sounded to me like, oh, it's just good enough. No, that's not what we want to shoot for. What we want to hear is that steep turn was beautiful. That steep turn was amazing. Okay, you might never hear your steep turns perfect because you're not a perfect robot operating in perfect conditions. But what you want to hear is that steep turn was incredible. Okay, so that's my little rant on we're within standards. But the example is this: if you do a steep turn and your instructor says, "Okay, that's good enough," and you sit there and go, "Nah, I want to get this a little tighter. I want my steep turns to be better." Here's another example of personal standards. Even though your instructor is okay with your steep turns, you could communicate to them and say, I love that you're okay with my steep turns. You could even do it after the flight. You should do it after the flight. Just do it on the debrief. I know that you're okay with my steep turns, and I know that it's within standards, but I wish to tighten my steep turns and make them a little nicer. It's just something you want to do, okay? And that's a standard you're holding yourself to. Maybe your instructor is okay with you losing 70 feet, but you're not. And if you're not, you could tighten it up, and you should tighten it up. And if your instructor does not want you to tighten it up, now they might not want you to tighten it up if, again, like I said before, you're going overboard and you're expecting something of yourself that's unrealistic. But I think you get where I'm going with this. If you have an instructor whose standards are the bare minimum, all I'm saying is raise yours a little higher above that. And it's within your right and within your power to do that. Oftentimes, we come into flight training as a student pilot, and I say this a lot. I can't think of another situation in life where people have a larger amount of inferiority complex than a brand new student pilot. I don't know. I'm not in the medical field. Maybe resident students or med students feel the same way in a hospital when they first start out. Could be. Let me know. I just know this is an industry that I know well. But it's amazing how student pilots come into this industry And all of a sudden, they just walk around with a sense that they're just nothing and no one. And that's interesting to me. So here I am telling you, take it from me. Keep your standards as high as you want them to be. Don't go overboard. Be careful. And don't go too much too soon. But remember, I don't care what standard your CFI assigns you or has for you. You could always come up with a personal standard just like you come up with your personal minimums. So keep that in mind. James, I hope this answers your question. I know I went on a little rant over here, but that's just because I'm very passionate about this whole standards thing. If you're a CFI out there, hold your students to higher standards. Please do. Again, don't go overboard. Just like I said, they shouldn't go overboard, but higher standards is a good thing. Okay? It takes a little sophistication, understanding when is a standard too high, right? You don't want to do it too soon. But generally speaking, hold your students to higher standard, because what that communicates with your student is that you believe they could do it. And when that message is communicated to a student, guess what they do 9 times out of 10? They step up to the plate and they live up to the occasion, and you'll be amazed. It's amazing how that works. So don't be afraid as a CFI to hold your students to higher standards, and don't be afraid as a student to hold yourself to higher standards. All right, you guys, that's all the time we have for this question, and we'll see y'all on the next one. Take care, everyone. Fly safe. Hey guys, it's Yoel. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it answered some of your questions, confusion, whatever it might be, that I was able to help you in your own flight training journey. If you did enjoy the video and you did find it helpful, I would appreciate if you would subscribe to the channel and like the video. What that does with the YouTube algorithm is it kind of lets the AI way of letting YouTube know that there's some interest here and there's some helpful information for others, and that way YouTube will share this with other students or people who are going through flight training just like you. So if you do those things, it always helps, and I do appreciate it. Secondly, if you also have a topic, a question, a topic, a concern, confusion, whatever it might be that you want me to talk about on these videos here, go ahead and email me. There's an email in the description of this video below. So if you click on the description of the video, you'll see an email. Email that email with your question or topic, whatever it is you want me to talk about. And in the subject line of the email, write Ask Yoel, because this series is what I call Ask Yoel. So that way when the emails come in, we're able to separate them and know that your email is a topic you want me to discuss on these videos. Anyhow, hope it was helpful, and I'll see you guys on the next video. Take care.